In this video, we start our exploration of the Noble Eightfold Path. And as we do so, we will learn about the earliest teachings of the Buddha as they are documented in the Pali Canon, the earliest, most complete, and least altered record we have of what the Buddha actually taught. There's a story the Buddha tells in the Pali Canon that explains how the Eightfold Path is not his invention, but a path to liberation that has existed since time immemorial. The Buddha begins with the following. Suppose a person was walking through a forest. They see an ancient path, an ancient route traveled by humans in the past. Following it along, they see an ancient city, an ancient capital, inhabited by humans in the past. And it's lovely, complete with parks, groves, lotus ponds, and embankments. Then that person would inform a king or their minister, "Please, sir, you should know this. While walking through a forest, I saw an ancient path, an ancient route traveled by humans in the past. Following it along, I saw an ancient city, an ancient capital, inhabited by humans in the past. It was lovely, complete with parks, groves, lotus ponds, and embankments. Sir, you should rebuild that city." Then that king or their minister would have that city rebuilt. And after some time, that city would become successful and prosperous and full of people promoting growth and expansion. In the same way, I saw an ancient path, an ancient route traveled by fully awakened Buddhas in the past. And what is that ancient path? The ancient road traveled by fully awakened Buddhas in the past? It's simply this, the Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. In this video, we'll be examining all of these 8 aspects or steps of the path and the teachings associated with them. In the process of doing so, we will be tracing the path one takes from being enslaved to sensuality and physical existence, driven by greed, hatred, and delusion, to the freedom of Nibbana, where there is no greed, no hatred, and no delusion, no birth, no sickness, no aging, no death, and no suffering. Often the path is divided into 3 sections: wisdom, ethical behavior, and mind development. Wisdom is at the beginning of the path and at the end of the path. There's some basic wisdom as a sort of academic understanding, at the beginning of the path, followed by ethical behavior and mental development. And there is transcendent wisdom at the end, which is not so much a part of the path as its destination. And because this is a path and not a buffet, it's important to remember that the steps of the path are sequential and cumulative. In the first part of the path are 2 aspects of basic wisdom: right view and right intention. We'll start with right view. There are 2 kinds of right view: the law of Kamma, which deals with how the sensual world of birth, suffering, aging, and death works, and the Four Noble Truths, which lays out the possibility of transcending the sensual world and attaining Nibbana. Beginning with the law of Kamma, the Buddha explains that there are four kinds of kamma. Kamma that is dark with a dark result, kamma that is bright with a bright result, kamma that is dark and bright with a dark and bright result, and kamma that is neither dark nor bright with neither a dark nor bright result. We'll begin by looking at the first three kinds of kamma. In the world, there's nothing permanent. Everything is always changing, and these changes are driven by kamma. Kamma actually means action, so everything is driven by action and reaction. However, in the ultimate or spiritual sense, the Buddha tells us that in the case of sentient beings, kamma is actually the intention behind action. So there are two ways to distinguish dark kammas from bright kammas. One is to determine whether the action has the intention to harm or not to harm behind it. The other is to determine if there is greed, hatred, and delusion driving the action, or generosity, goodwill, and clear thinking. Greed, hatred, and delusion are known as the three defilements, and we'll be visiting them again. The fourth kind of kamma is the kamma that is neither dark nor bright, with neither dark nor bright result. The Buddha said this is the kind of kamma that puts an end to kamma, and it's the kamma of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. To achieve good results by doing good kamma is a mundane or worldly aim. The aim of the Eightfold Path is to go completely beyond the tyranny of kamma. The Four Noble Truths, the second aspect of right view, are the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and the truth of the path to the end of suffering. Or more succinctly, suffering exists, it has a cause, it can end, and there's a way to end it. The First Noble Truth says, quite simply, that there is suffering. The Buddha gave some examples saying, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, being separated from what is loved is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. And then he said somewhat cryptically, in short, the five aggregates of clinging are suffering. Let's look at this last statement. First of all, what are the five aggregates? The five aggregates are the components of what we take ourselves to be. That is, a body that gives us a location in space, along with some sense organs to experience the sense objects in the world, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings or sensations that arise from sense activities, perceptions that come together as we compare what we are experiencing with what we have experienced, all the many other more complex psychologically constructed mental fabrications we have, such as thoughts, ideas, opinions, prejudices, compulsions, decisions, emotions, stories, and so on. And finally, the conscious experiences of sense activities that we have when sense organ and sense object contact each other. However, the Buddha didn't say the five aggregates are suffering. They simply are what they are. He said the five aggregates of clinging are suffering. And what did he mean by that? He meant the body that is clung to and identified with, feelings that are clung to and identified with, perceptions that are clung to and identified with, mental formations that are clung to and identified with, and conscious sensory experiences that are clung to and identified with. And how do they become suffering? We cling to them as ours, who we are, ourselves. But each and every one of them is impermanent. We cling to them as if they were permanent, that is, as a lasting identity. But eventually they show up as not ours, not who we are, and not self. If not right away, then eventually, certainly when we die. This dissonance of what is true and what we want to be true is ignorance, not only in the sense of not knowing, but also in the sense of ignoring what we do know. The denial of what is in plain sight. The consequence of this ignorance is ever greater craving and clinging, which is, as we will see, the cause of ever greater suffering. So, building on the idea of ignoring the truth, let's look a little deeper into this problem. We know that the aggregates are impermanent, and thereby unsatisfactory in many ways, and not part of an enduring identity. But we refuse to accept that truth. In fact, we deny it. There's a teaching of the Buddha called the Four Perversions that describes this perfectly. The Buddha said, there are these four perversions of perception, mind, and view. What for? Taking impermanence as permanence, taking suffering as pleasure, taking not self as self, taking ugliness as beauty. These are the four perversions of perception, mind, and view. Then he went on to elaborate on this teaching in verse. Perceiving impermanence as permanence, suffering as pleasure, not self as self, and ugliness as beauty, sentient beings are ruined by wrong view, deranged, out of their mind. Yoked by Mara's yoke, these people find no sanctuary from the yoke. Sentient beings continue to transmigrate with ongoing birth and death, and more births and more deaths. But when the Buddhas arise in the world, shedding radiance, they shine a light on this teaching that leads to the stilling of suffering. When a wise person hears them, they get their mind back, seeing impermanence as impermanence, suffering as suffering, not self as not self, and ugliness as ugliness. Taking up right view, they've risen above all suffering. I should mention that Mara is a demon figure that is used in the teachings to personify both the heedless intoxication with and the tyranny of being enslaved to living in the world of the insatiable senses and endless birth, suffering, death, and rebirth. We have already said the five aggregates have the fundamental characteristics of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness or suffering, and not selfness, just like everything else in the world. This teaching is formally known as the three characteristics, and it's important to keep in mind as we explore the teachings of the Buddha. The three characteristics apply to everything that is worldly. Whatever happiness we enjoy, whatever pleasures we find, they all are guaranteed to come to an end, and we suffer and feel loss as a result. This is not a good state of affairs, but it's the best the world has to offer. This is what the Buddha means when he says, there is suffering. The second noble truth is that there is a cause of suffering, and that cause of suffering is craving and clinging. Craving what we don't have that we want, and clinging to what we have that we don't want to lose. We crave and cling to certain kinds of sensual experiences. We crave and cling to becoming in certain ways. We crave and cling to not becoming in other ways. Essentially, this truth says we are in an endless state of distress because we either don't have what we want and we crave it, or we have what we want and cling to it, fearing, rightly, that it won't last. More specifically, in the Suttas, the Buddha says the cause of suffering is craving to have certain sensual experiences and clinging to them, craving to become in certain ways and clinging to that, becoming, and craving not to become in certain ways and clinging to that, not becoming. The cause of suffering is also often conveniently described elsewhere in the teachings as greed, hatred, and delusion. These are known as the three defilements and were mentioned earlier. Greed is analogous to wanting to become and clinging to it. Hatred to not wanting to become and clinging to that. Delusion is analogous to craving sensuality, thinking it will somehow satisfy, and clinging to it. The third noble truth is the cessation of suffering. The cessation of suffering is the complete fading away and cessation of craving and clinging. And this cessation of suffering is called Nibbana. But what is Nibbana? Nibbana is complete liberation from Kamma and its endless consequences. Now, people always want to know all the details of what Nibbana is like. Well, I can say one thing, it's out of this world. But beyond that, we ordinary worldlings living in a conditional world can't really know it until we experience it. Describing Nibbana is a little like describing the taste of salt. You have to taste it to really know what it's like. Suffice it to say that the Buddha consistently implied Nibbana is worth striving for, and most definitely is not annihilation, which it is sometimes mistaken for. The Buddha also said speculative discussions about Nibbana are nothing more than a thicket of views that get in the way of progress. He said it was like arguing over where a fire goes after it runs out of fuel. In fact, in many ways, Nibbana is something that happens more than a condition or state. Nibbana literally means to go out like a fire and to cool. Nibbana is the extinguishing of the fevers of greed, hatred, and delusion. Craving and clinging is the fuel of suffering, and Nibbana happens when the fuel of craving and clinging is removed. The fourth noble truth is the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, that being, of course, the Noble Eightfold Path we are studying. The Buddha sometimes described the practice of his teaching as the gradual training, because the Eightfold Path involves a process of mind-body transformation that unfolds over a sometimes lengthy period. So, having covered the two extensive topics of Kamma and the Four Noble Truths in right view, we can now move on to the second step of the path, right intention. Right intention consists of renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. Renunciation is a somewhat daunting word, but in essence, renunciation is simply letting go of what one craves and clings to, and letting go of what one does compulsively as best one can, given where they are in the practice. It might start with just a modicum of generosity, restraint, and simpler living. Certainly something we can all do to some degree. It's important to know that renunciation, rather than being something one resents, becomes something desirable, something one seeks as one gains traction in the practice and the teachings. It's like getting rid of the junk in a closet, or having one car instead of two. It just makes things easier. The other two parts of right intention, goodwill, and harmlessness are somewhat easier to understand, though not always easy to accomplish and maintain. Like all the steps of the path, right intention is deeply integrated with the rest of the path. Intention is the forerunner of action, and views are the forerunner of intentions. So, when wrong views prevail, the outcome is wrong intentions, giving rise to wrong kinds of actions. When right views prevail, the intentions will be right and will give rise to right actions. It's really important to put these things together in the right order. It's a losing battle to try to correct your actions if your intentions are wrong. The path is constructed the way it is for a very logical reason. Without right view and right intention securely in place, the rest of the path simply falls apart. And now we move on to look at the ethical behavior division of the path, consisting of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. As I've said earlier, the Noble Eightfold Path is both sequential and cumulative. So it makes sense that the Buddha would present these disciplines in this order. As the Buddha said, right speech gives rise to right action. Right action gives rise to right livelihood. And of course, right view is the forerunner of them all. Earlier we may have wondered if it's really necessary to know about Kamma, the three defilements, the three characteristics, the five aggregates of clinging, the Four Noble Truths, and all the other aspects of right view. I hope we now can begin to see how all the steps of the path we are addressing go right back to right view, which explains what our situation is and why we need to get on the path in the first place. In line with that, there is a quote you may have heard attributed to many different sources, including, falsely, to the Buddha, that goes like this: watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your actions. Watch your actions, they become your habits. Watch your habits, they become your character. Watch your character, it becomes your destiny. The arrangement of the individual steps of the Eightfold Path certainly reflects the logic and wisdom of this saying. The only thing I would add is to precede it with watch your views and intentions, because they become your thoughts. And now let's take a look at right speech, the first of the ethical behavior section of the path. The Buddha says there are basically four kinds of speech that should be avoided: false speech, slanderous speech, harsh speech, and frivolous speech or idle chatter. Because the impact of our speech is often not as immediate as our actions, we tend to be pretty relaxed about what comes out of our mouth. We assume we have a right to express ourselves no matter what. But speech and its comrade, the written word, have a huge potential for doing harm. This is especially true in this age of social media. Wrong speech is very harmful to our collective well-being, whether it's within our family or in the national arena. And of course, wrong speech always greases the skids for wrong action. Our instinct and habit is to heedlessly blurt out our opinions, judgments, intentions, and thoughts, regardless of their rightness or wrongness. It can feel good to do so in the short term, but to do so is also extremely risky. I used to be told when I was a kid that if I didn't have something nice to say, I shouldn't say anything at all. I doubt I followed that advice very often, but there certainly is some wisdom to it. Next in the ethical behavior section of the path is right action. Right action consists of abstaining from taking life, abstaining from stealing, and abstaining from sexual misconduct. Abstaining from taking life means to abstain from taking the life of sentient beings, which are, for practical purposes, insects, animals, and human beings. A sentient being is a being that has a mind or consciousness. What is precluded here is the intentional taking of life. This is a difficult area because it brings up issues around what we eat, euthanasia out of compassion, dealing with irksome household pests like mice and ants, and other ambiguous situations. These gray areas of right and wrong action brings us into the uncomfortable realm of dark and bright Kamma, with dark and bright results. Abstaining from stealing can be another tough one. Once again, intent plays an important role. Technically, stealing is expressed in the Pali Canon as taking what is not given. Breaking into someone's house and stealing their possessions is pretty clear-cut. But other situations, like the Byzantine maze of intellectual property rights, are less clear and wander into that dark and bright Kamma area again, where intention is of great importance. Abstaining from sexual misconduct can require some thoughtfulness and self-examination too, depending on your situation. From the spiritual standpoint, this injunction is an opportunity to rein in some of the expansive tendencies of sexual desire. From an ethical standpoint, it helps preserve trust and fidelity in marital unions and protects innocent people from becoming victims of predators. The Pali Canon describes sexual misconduct as getting sexually involved with those who are protected by their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their relatives, or their religion. Also, with those with spouses, those whom it is illegal to be sexually involved, and those engaged to another. Beyond that, once again, we have to examine our intentions and negotiate the dark and bright Kamma as best we can. Following these ethical steps of the path is not always clear-cut, easy, or convenient, given that we live in a dark and bright Kamma world. But it is an opportunity to explore our intentions and examine our habits, and to realize that these steps of the path are in place for a reason, so we should do our best to heed them. And now let's look at right livelihood, the last step of the ethical behavior section of the path. The Buddha says we should sustain ourselves legally, peacefully, and honestly first of all. He also admonished that certain ways of earning a livelihood are inherently wrong, like dealing in weapons, dealing in living beings, including raising animals for slaughter, slave trading, prostitution, meat production and butchery, making and selling poisons, making and selling intoxicants. The Buddha also says that deceit, treachery, soothsaying, trickery, and usury are all unwholesome and unskillful ways of earning a livelihood. Just as before, there are plenty of dark and bright areas to right livelihood where we have to examine our intentions and try to negotiate for the most ethical results given the sometimes impossible situations we find ourselves in. So far we've learned the Noble Eightfold Path is progressive and cumulative, and there are no shortcuts to its destination. We learned that one must develop the intention of letting go, that is, renunciation, the intention of goodwill, and the intention to cause no harm, if one wants to walk the path. And we learn that one also must engage in speech, actions, and ways of earning a living that are ethical and moral to successfully travel the path. Now we can begin looking at the mind development section of the path. Mind development is the part of the Eightfold Path that directly addresses training the mind and meditation. It consists of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So we begin with right effort. Right effort consists of what is sometimes called the four great endeavors: the effort to prevent the arising of unwholesome states, the effort to abandon unwholesome states that have arisen, the effort to develop wholesome states that have not arisen, and the effort to maintain wholesome states that have arisen. The Buddha stresses the need for effort, diligence, exertion, and unflagging perseverance throughout the suttas. The Buddha does what he can for us by pointing out the path to liberation, but we need to summon the energy and make the effort to put the path into practice. The unwholesome states that are mentioned in the endeavors are the defilements, which we've spoken of before: greed, hatred, and delusion. However, in terms of meditation and achieving concentration, the unwholesome states are more subtly known as the Five Hindrances. The success of meditation depends on the hindrances being at least held at bay during meditation or gotten rid of entirely, at least temporarily. These are the five hindrances specifically: sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and remorse, and doubt. The defilement of greed manifests as sensual desire in the hindrances. Hatred manifests as ill will, and delusion manifests variously as sloth and torpor, restlessness and remorse, and doubt. Sloth and torpor means reluctance to make an effort and sluggishness. It is interesting that the Buddha sees remorse as a state related to restlessness. We tend to think remorse is something worthwhile, but the Buddha seems to see it as just another self-feeding, restless activity. And I think he's right. Doubt is perverse, unfounded skepticism of the teachings, and doubt in one's capacity to follow the teachings. All five of these hindrances make it impossible to successfully meditate. The most effective way to deal with them is to bring the mind to stillness through mindfulness and concentration. Doing this will temporarily prevent the hindrances from arising. It's important to remember that the hindrances do not come from outside the mind, but from within. Let's now consider the wholesome states in meditation that we want to encourage and nurture. The 7 factors of enlightenment are the essential wholesome mind states we need to develop as meditators. Like so much of the Buddha's teaching, these factors are sequential. The first wholesome quality that needs to be developed is mindfulness of a meditation object. When the mind can stay on the meditation object, there is likely to be some natural investigation of the object arising. For example, with mindfulness of breathing, one might be inclined to investigate whether the breath is long or short, tense or relaxed, fast or slow, and so on. This investigation is a good thing, and as one gets into it, so to speak, energy will arise, leading to a mental state of rapture. This is a state where the mind becomes and remains joyfully established on the object of meditation. Rapture will lead to tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. So the 7 factors are all wholesome states that need to be nurtured and developed as they arise. But remember, they're a process with one state leading to the next, not 7 wholesome states that need to be maintained separately and simultaneously. And now on to right mindfulness. The word mindfulness is used in a few different ways in the early Buddhist teachings. It can mean to remember, it can mean to pay attention to, and it can mean to directly experience. The Buddha presents the teaching of right mindfulness as the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of the mind, and mindfulness of fundamental teachings. Once again, this is a teaching that is often treated as 4 independent, maybe even arbitrary, areas of practicing mindfulness that can be done in any order. However, my experience is that they are sequential and progressive when it comes to meditation. To start with mindfulness of what you're thinking, and then to switch to mindfulness of an itchy ear, then maybe to mindfulness of the birds singing in the trees, is way too erratic to be of benefit. Similarly, to choose just one foundation of mindfulness and stick to it exclusively, for instance, limiting mindfulness to mindfulness of the body, as so many teachers tend to do, doesn't go very far either. One needs to start with mindfulness of the body because it's fairly easy, and then progress to mindfulness of sensations and feelings because it's only a little harder, and then progress to mindfulness of the mind itself and mindfulness of fundamental teachings. This is the order in which the Buddha always presents the teaching on right mindfulness. As we said, mindfulness itself can mean a few things. It can mean to keep in mind, and it can mean to remember or recall. So in the case of the first 3 foundations of mindfulness, we are asked to keep in mind what is going on with the body, the feelings, and the mind itself. If we're mindful of the body, we may notice that it's breathing heavily, or maybe gently. If we are mindful of feelings, we may notice that we are feeling pleasantness, or perhaps unpleasantness. If we are mindful of the mind itself, we may notice that it is quiet, or maybe it's distracted by thoughts and emotions. However, to be mindful of fundamental teachings, we must recall certain teachings of the Buddha and apply them to the current reality. Typically, this is recalling the teaching on the 3 characteristics: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not-selfness, and applying them to the 5 aggregates, that is, the body, feelings, perceptions, mental fabrications, and sensory consciousness. Mindfulness, when applied sufficiently, will result in a calming of the activities and qualities of the body and the mind, so that one begins to stop thinking about what is happening and to begin directly experiencing what is happening. At this point, jhana, or right concentration, which we'll look at next, is developing. It's important to realize that mindfulness and concentration develop hand in hand. A little mindfulness will result in a little concentration. Better mindfulness will result in better concentration. Though they work in conjunction with each other, they are not the same thing. Mindfulness is the cause, concentration is the result. As one progresses through the first 3 foundations of mindfulness, a level of concentration will develop that brings the equanimity necessary to become established in the 4th foundation of mindfulness, the deep inquiry into the way things really are. So we've learned that when we meditate, we need to let go of sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and remorse, and doubt. we also need to develop mindfulness, inquisitiveness, rapture, energy, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity in that order. And finally, when we meditate, we need to be mindful of the body, the feelings, the mind, and fundamental teachings in that order. So, let's talk about right concentration. We'll begin by saying it is critical to understand that right concentration is really stillness of the mind and not some kind of concentration of the mind in the usual sense of the word. In right concentration, the mind is gradually brought to stillness by relaxing its tendency toward discursive thinking. This is developed by dropping discursive activities of the mind until there is only a soft awareness of a meditation object, if that. I must say it's unfortunate that the Pali phrase for right concentration has traditionally been translated as right concentration. It might have been better if they had translated it right mental relaxation, or right mental stillness, or right serenity, or right tranquility, but they chose the word concentration. Sadly, concentration connotes intense effort, and samadhi is quite the opposite of intense effort. Perhaps the early translators did not fully understand that bringing the mind to so-called single-pointedness was not a matter of effort, but rather a matter of relaxation and relinquishment. It is this kind of right concentration or mental stillness that is so necessary to achieving liberation. As we said, concentration gradually develops hand in hand with the four foundations of mindfulness. The Buddha typically defines right concentration as the four jhanas, which are states of deep meditative absorption in which attention is unified with a fixed meditation object. The mind becomes secluded from sensory engagements and all unwholesome states are abandoned. If the four foundations of mindfulness are followed progressively, it seems to help elicit the four jhanas progressively. One certainly does not need to complete all four foundations of mindfulness to achieve first jhana, but neither is there a guarantee of any jhana after completing all four foundations of mindfulness, especially without the foundation of the preceding 7 steps of the path. There's a subtle relationship between mindfulness and jhana that needs to be worked out in your own practice. Remember that the real purpose of jhana is to keep the hindrances at bay and to provide access to the subconscious and unconscious dimensions of the mind. The experience of jhana itself is secondary. Sometimes a great deal is made of attaining different levels of jhana, but in the suttas themselves, jhana seems to be treated as a common experience for meditators and not an extraordinary accomplishment. The Buddha did say that there are meditators inclined toward serenity practices like the jhanas, and meditators inclined toward the insight practices that we'll investigate shortly. His advice was for those inclined toward serenity to seek instruction in insight, and vice versa for those inclined towards insight. So obviously, the Buddha saw the need for a balanced practice when it comes to serenity and insight. So let's look a little more closely at what the jhanas are and how they progress. The Buddha describes the first jhana thusly: withdrawn from sensuality, withdrawn from unwholesome qualities, one enters and remains in the first jhana, which has rapture and pleasure born from withdrawal, accompanied by initial and sustained thought. What is important here is that there is initial thought that is placed on the object of concentration, perhaps the breath, and then sustained thought as the thinking remains on aspects of the breath. Once the thinking stays put, so to speak, the states of rapture and pleasure become established. The Buddha continues with the second jhana. With the stilling of initial and sustained thought and the gaining of confidence, one enters and remains in the second jhana, which has rapture and pleasure born of concentration and unification of awareness free from initial and sustained thought. In the second jhana, there is no discursive thinking, but there is still rapture and pleasure, which is now a result of concentration rather than withdrawal. And then the third jhana. With the fading of rapture, one remains equanimous, mindful, and alert, and senses pleasure with the body. One enters and remains in the third jhana, of which the noble ones declare, equanimous and mindful, one has a pleasant abiding. In the third jhana, there is no more rapture, but there is the new element of equanimity accompanied by pleasure. And finally, the fourth jhana, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the earlier disappearance of rapture and grief, one enters and remains in the fourth jhana, which has purity of equanimity and mindfulness, and neither pleasure nor pain. In the fourth jhana, there is only equanimity accompanied by mindfulness. So breaking these definitions of the jhanas down a bit, we see that there are 5 jhanic factors: initial thought, sustained thought, rapture, pleasantness, and equanimity. The first jhana has the first 4 factors. The second jhana has rapture and pleasantness only. The third jhana has pleasantness and an additional factor of equanimity, also known as one-pointedness, tranquility of mind, or unification of mind. The fourth jhana has only equanimity. Keep in mind the transition from one jhana level to another happens effortlessly, and there is no struggle necessary to make it happen. It is also unnecessary to keep track of what jhana factors are present and to what degree. The whole point is to bring the mind to stillness, and ruminating on the nature of your jhana is actually a step in the wrong direction. Just set up the right conditions of withdrawal from sensuality, relaxed persistence, and mindfulness of your meditation object, and the rest takes care of itself. The Buddha says, right view gives rise to right intention. Right intention gives rise to right speech. Right speech gives rise to right action. Right action gives rise to right livelihood. Right livelihood gives rise to right effort. Right effort gives rise to right mindfulness. Right mindfulness gives rise to right concentration. And right concentration gives rise to insight. Insight gives rise to liberation. This is how the Buddha describes the unfolding of the Eightfold Path with its transcendental destination of insight and liberation. One step of the path seems to naturally ripen and open to the next, sequentially, cumulatively, and without resistance. At this point, we have covered the entire Eightfold Path, but what we have not covered is the fulfillment of the path, the reason for traveling the path, namely insight and liberation. These are transcendental states that are not easily described in worldly terms, but we can look at them in terms of what they accomplish, which is the extinguishing of greed, hatred, and delusion, the causes of suffering. We can also look at them in terms of what they ultimately lead to, the relinquishing of the five aggregates of clinging that form the experiential foundation of suffering. We've talked about the defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion, but what we have not looked into yet is that there are actually 3 layers of the defilements to deal with. The layer of active transgression, the layer of mental obsession, and the layer of subconscious latency, known as underlying tendencies in the Pali Canon. The first 2 layers are consciously experienced and are addressed in the ethical behavior and the mind development sections of the path. However, only insight, a penetrating revelation of the true nature of things, can cut off the subconscious latent tendencies of the defilements. This is because ignorance is the root of the defilements, and insight removes ignorance once and for all, liberating us from the defilements and from suffering. At the very end of the path is the 4th level of mindfulness that we mentioned previously, and it needs to be thoroughly developed after the equanimity of jhana and concentration has been established, to gain the actual experience of insight. This level of meditation begins with the contemplation of the 3 characteristics: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness or suffering, and not-selfness, and progresses through the development of disenchantment with and dispassion for the limitations and incompleteness of worldliness. Then the cessation of craving and clinging, of greed, hatred, and delusion, and of suffering occurs, creating the conditions for the relinquishment of all that keeps us bound to the world of birth, suffering, and death, which are, of course, the 5 aggregates of clinging. And so one relinquishes the body, the feelings, perceptions, mental fabrications, and conscious sense experiences forever. This sounds extreme, and it is, but it's not so much something that one has to do. It is something that one is ready to allow to happen when it is time. Why cling to that which we can't really own, to that which we have no autonomy over, to that which is the embodiment of suffering itself? The Buddha put it this way to his followers: the body is not self, for if the body were self, it wouldn't lead to affliction, and you could compel the body. May my body be like this, may it not be like that. But because the body is not self, it leads to affliction, and you can't compel the body. May my body be like this, and may it not be like that. Similarly, feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and conscious sense experiences are not self. For if they were self, they wouldn't lead to affliction, and you could compel them. May they be like this, and may they not be like that. But because they are not self, they lead to affliction, and you can't compel them. May they be like this, and may they not be like that. What do you think? Is the body permanent or impermanent? Of course the body is impermanent. But if it's impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? Again, it's suffering. But if it's impermanent, suffering, and not self, is it fit to be regarded thus? This is mine, I am this is myself? No, it's not. So you should truly see any kind of form at all, including the body, with right understanding. This is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. You should truly see any kind of feeling, any kind of perception, any kind of mental fabrication, any kind of conscious sense experience with right understanding. This is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. Seeing this, a learned, noble disciple grows disillusioned and disenchanted with the body, feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and conscious sense experiences. Being disillusioned and disenchanted, desire fades away. When desire fades away, one is freed, and when one is freed, one knows they're freed. They understand. Rebirth is ended. The spiritual journey has been completed. What had to be done has been done, and there is no return to any state of worldly existence. Thank you for watching this video on the Ancient Path. I hope you have found it beneficial and will consider taking it to heart by walking it and living it in the days ahead. Please visit suttapath.org for more information about the early Buddhist teachings and for resources to help you practice them.